Good morning, everyone. Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. If you can take your seats, thanks. We're going to get going with today's keynote session. My name is Robert Platt. I'm the program chair for Halifax 2020 ICP 2023. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to Halifax, to Canada, and to this year's ICP. We have a really fantastic program over the next 3 days. It's really jammed with exciting science. Thank you to the program committee for producing and sorting and organizing a great program. Thank you to everyone who has contributed through symposia, through workshops, through presentations. We look forward to hearing about your science. We have a wonderful social event planned for tomorrow night as well. I hope you enjoy your time here in Halifax, your time at the meeting. I want to say thank you to everyone who is here, to our team from Kellen, to our sponsors and our exhibitors. Please make sure that you take some time to check out the exhibits down in the lower levels and enjoy the meeting. And with that, I'll turn it over to our president, who we think still has his voice, Toby Gerhard, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Robert. I'll try to stand here. I try to not fall off. My name's Toby Gerhard. I'm professor of pharmacy and epidemiology at Rutgers, and I had the great privilege for the last year to be president of the society. I have to apologize. I lost my voice about a week ago. It didn't quite come back in time, but it's quite a bit better than it has been the past days for those that have tried to talk to me back then. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to Halifax, to welcome all of you to ICP 2023. The motto of the conference is the global home for the science of real-world evidence. And we have, as Robert already stated, a really packed program. We had over 1,500 abstracts submitted. We have over 1,700 attendees at the meeting. We have 3 plenary sessions, the first of which, the keynote, will start immediately after this. We have 20 symposia and workshops, over 200 oral presentations, and almost 1,000 poster presentations. So nobody should be bored during the coming 3 days. The motto of our society, of the conference today, is not just an aspiration. As you can see here, we have attendees from over 44 countries today here and over the conference. Before I hand off to the keynote, I have to thank a few people. First and foremost, the members of the Scientific Program Committee and Robert as the chair of the committee. They have really done the work to put this program together. So I would ask for a big round of applause for the program committee and for Robert. I want to thank the board of directors of the society who steered the society over the past year. I want to thank my colleagues on the executive committee, Vin Loray, Caitlin Knox, James Rack, and Lisa Pont, who worked with me very closely on the executive committee over the past year. But first and foremost, really, I want to thank all of you, the chairs and members of committees, councils, special interest groups, regional interest groups, all of you who submitted abstracts, who are presenting posters, oral presentations, symposia, and workshops. It really takes a village to make a society, a grassroots society like ISPE work. And it's just wonderful to see year after year how this society comes together and puts on really fantastic meetings. I also want to thank our sponsors who really made this meeting possible, in parts our platinum sponsor, AstraZeneca, our numerous gold, silver, and bronze sponsors, as well as the academic showcase sponsors. And I want to close with just a few suggestions for the meetings. Feel free to take them or leave them as you wish. Contribute to the scientific debate, be active. approach people after they gave their presentations, engage them in discussions. This is why we're meeting in person and why this is so much better than the virtual meetings that we had a few years back. So take advantage of it. Learn something new. Don't just go to the sessions in your areas of expertise. Maybe pick one that's new, that's kind of a new area where you're branching out. So don't just stay in your wheelhouse. To the students and new members, approach us. We're friendly. This society is committed to the next generation of scientists and members. So please do. Renew friendships, make more friends. This is really a society of friends. I can't count the friends I have in this society, and I'm looking forward to making some more. Find some new communities, attend SIG meetings, RIG meetings, council meetings, committee meetings, just be active. And last, but certainly not least, dance at the social event. And with that, the only thing I have left to say is enjoy your time in Halifax. And with that, I'm handing off to Donna Rivera, who will introduce the keynote session.
Good morning. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this ICPE and alongside my international colleagues to the inaugural ISPE RWE Town Hall, a global regulatory forum on real-world evidence. I'm Donna Rivera, Associate Director for Pharmacoepidemiology in the Oncology Center of Excellence at the US FDA. So during this session, the objective is to provide a forum to facilitate discussion on highly relevant topics and methods at the intersection of regulatory science and pharmacoepidemiology between ISPE and the international regulatory community. There are three aims for the session, which are to foster transparency and communication with regulatory agencies, international collaboration and harmonization, and opportunities for the role of ISPE in the use of real-world evidence. I'd like to give you a preview of this two-part session where we are taking a dynamic and interactive approach within a new town hall format. The first part of the session is going to be a fireside chat with leaders from Health Canada and the US Food and Drug Administration, setting the stage with a discussion around the most pertinent issues facing the field. The second part will shift to a traditional panel session with brief presentations, followed by a panel discussion among global regulators, moderated by the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Califf. At the conclusion of the panel, there's an opportunity for interaction through a Q&A session. And I'd like to give a bit of instruction for that. If you have questions for the panel, please go to this website, ttpoll.com, and enter in ICPE RWE as the session. Then, if you'd like to enter a question, select messaging. We'll be taking questions throughout the session. So again, here's the website. You can enter the session code ICPE RWE, and then to enter a question, select messaging. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Brian Strom to moderate the fireside chat. Thank you.
So thank you, Donna, and it's a pleasure to be here and be back in Halifax, and with a wonderful panel that we have here with Rob Califf and Pam. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a second. Again, my name is Brian Strom. I'm Chancellor of Biomedical and Health Sciences at Rutgers University.
Sure. Is this a live mic? I hope so.
Sounds like it.
Okay.
We can take this one.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Pam Allen-Finn, and I am the Assistant Deputy Minister of Health Canada.
And good morning, Rob Califf, Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration.
I'll just say a few words to start. So first of all, I want to give everyone a very warm and hearty welcome here to Halifax, and in particular our colleagues from the US. And you can see My colleague here is in full regalia with the all Canadian bow tie. So thank you for that. Very pleased to be here and with among so many experts from around the world here in Halifax, not only in the room, but I understand that we have 200 or 300 people online as well. So if you've dialed in, it's an old word, but dialed in, welcome. Thank you. Is that better?
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the organizing committee, of course, for this opportunity, the FDA for hosting today's session, and Dr. Calif in particular for inviting us from Health Canada to this session. For us, it's a great opportunity to showcase and discuss our work and the work of the regulatory panelists that will be speaking to us a little later. Just some historical context from a Health Canada perspective in the RWE space. Maybe I'll move this back a bit. We've been working on RWE initiatives since we launched the Regulatory Review of Drugs and Devices. We call that R2D2. Yes, we have Star Wars fans at Health Canada, and we launched that in 2017. And it's a 5-year initiative that included a number of expected outcomes. And those outcomes included an increase of the use of RWE to enhance regulatory decision-making, an improvement in the use and sharing of RWE with our healthcare system partners, increase clarity for stakeholders on where and how our RWE can be used to support regulatory decision-making, and perhaps most critically, improving access to health products for people in Canada through the use of new sources of evidence to support approval. To achieve these outcomes, we focused on a number of areas to gain a better understanding of key information gaps during the drug life cycle. And that included how RWE can be used to inform our decision-making and implementing the strategic use of real-world data and real-world evidence across the drug life cycle. We've had folks in engagements with other regulators, many of them, domestic partners and stakeholders, and that was also crucial to explore access to RWE. And since that time, we've considered RWE for decision-making as part of the totality of evidence in pre-market drug packages, and we've used RWE to help inform our signal detection, pharmacovigilance, and risk management activities in the post-market. We've also published documents and including a notice on optimizing the use of RWE and accompanying documents to that. One of our health technology assessors here in Canada is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies, known as CADTH, and I'll be talking about them a little bit later. They've been a key domestic partner in advancing RWE and have worked on several projects and initiatives with our international colleagues, including the FDA, of course, as well as other stakeholders, including academics, industry, patient groups, and others. And so, Brian, I look very much forward to speaking and highlighting some of these collaborations today and discussing potential future things that we can do together. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps Robert has some other additional words.
Thank you, Rob.
Brian, I'm going to be very brief because I think you'll ask some provocative questions. I had Brian and I go way back, and we had a discussion night before last that led me to believe that we kind of tend to think the same way, but use different words to describe it. So it'll be interesting to see how this comes out. My career in RWE goes back to 1977 when I was a medical student working with a database and doing observational analyses of treatment outcomes in coronary disease. And I distinctly remember every 3 months or so, we had to make a visit to the NIH to defend why we weren't using randomization in everything that we did. But it's come full circle for me because I'm just going to make one comment, and I know we'll get into a lot of interesting things during the question. I really think the most important thing to keep in mind, and it's coming out in efforts that you'll hear about across the U.S. government, including FDA, is that we need to think about 2 dimensions here. One is the data, and the data can come from this whole spectrum of places, ranging from a rarefied research clinic in a particular place that people have to go to in order to get data collected, to what happens in a healthcare system with electronic health records and other sources of data, to people's homes, where I had the chance to work for 5 years in employment at Alphabet, working on that sphere. So that's one dimension. The other dimension is the method that we use, the research plan that we have to deal with those data. And those methods could include anything from, we got a bunch of data, let's analyze it, to, we're going to do a very specific phase 1 study in a research unit where every infusion is timed to the millisecond. And rather than have these divisions of real world evidence versus randomization, I think that's entirely wrong because they mix up those two dimensions. We need to decide for the question that we have, for the purpose that we have, what is a source of data and the research design that's fit for that purpose. And we'll talk about, I was pleased about the mention of looking at where the gaps in data and information are. And I would argue that our phase 1 through phase 3A part of the medical product development world works pretty darn well. We screen out things that don't work, like 90% of drugs that enter phase 1 don't make it to market because they're screened out. And then things are put forward that work, at least in some population, in some kind of a study. And then, at least in the US, we throw them over the transom and all kinds of chaos happens after that. And I think we need to really focus on that next part. So I was really thrilled to see your program with sort of like the home for real world evidence as a place for this society. There's a lot of work to do.
So as Rob alluded to, he and I go way back. Decades ago, we were both PIs of CERTS, Centers for Education and Research and Therapeutics, a program funded by AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. At that point, we didn't agree so much. Where Rob was advocating only for randomized trials, and I was advocating, at least primarily, if not only, for observational trials. We have both grown up since, and so what I'd like to ask Rob and Pam is, from a regulatory point of view, what's your definition of pharmacoepi, and what do you see the role of pharmacoepi in regulation of pharmaceuticals or other related products like biologics or devices?
I don't know what the definition of pharmacoepi is, and we talked about this. I like real world data and real world evidence as things that need to be increasingly defined so people use the same names to describe the same thing. The one problem with the term pharmacoepi is that it's not just about pharmaco. The methods used for all medical products are pertinent as far as I'm concerned, and healthcare interventions of behavioral types also, I think, should be amenable to this. I do want to mention here that because of all the terminology confusion, by the way, I asked Brian, is there a certification to be a pharmacoepidemiologist, since he's in some ways the godfather of the field? And he said no. So I rest my case. But we are now embarking on an effort with between FDA and NIH to get started on a glossary of terms, because one thing that frustrates me a lot is people will use a name like pharmacoepi, and people who don't know the details will assume that it doesn't pertain to medical devices or other kinds of interventions, when really I think what we're talking about is a body of methods and expertise that are applicable across healthcare interventions.
Pam?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So can't disagree with any of that, of course, but I think that's a big part of why we collaborate. And I think that's one of the things we want to talk about this morning. So part of that is developing those common definitions, having guidance, bringing that commonality and understanding across fields, so that we can move forward on these things. So I won't add very much more to that and to your expertise, but you might have some things to say as well, since you're the godfather.
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with the definitions you guys talked about. And the other thing I would add is data, in addition to methods, is data resources. And I think part of what makes the methods of pharmacoepi are typically the methods of epidemiology. What we've needed to do is develop data resources to enable us to apply them to massive numbers of people in a very time efficient way. So there have been times in the history of the field where if it's not a database study, people say it's not pharmacoepi. I think that's completely wrong. But it's certainly, we study devices, we study biologics, we do randomized trials in addition to observational study. Many of our studies use databases, but certainly you don't have to. And my own bias is you need to focus on the question and approach the right method and the right data source and the right approach to get the best answer to that question, rather than being blinded and using the risk of a label is people are too narrow than in defining it. One of the things as a society we have all struggled with enormously over the course of the last 3 years is scientific misinformation and sort of or misinformation put forward as if it's scientific in a way that has really hurt the society and has hurt public health. In the meantime, do you see a role for regulators in addressing that?
I have to be very careful here because we have several major court cases going on in the U.S. with testing the views of what the government is in dealing with misinformation. I'm on record, Brian, and I'll just repeat it. I think that misinformation is the leading cause of premature death in the United States today. We just look at, what's caused. We're having this really profound drop in life expectancy in the U.S., as you know, quite different than all other high-income countries. In fact, we're in last place right now in high-income countries. And this is relatively recent phenomenon. It's been, the last 3 years, of course, a lot of it's been driven by COVID, where we had vaccines and antivirals, both with profound effects on reducing risk of death and hospitalization, with many people choosing not to get them, even though they were free, because they have been led to believe that they weren't useful or helpful. So hundreds of thousands of people. But in addition to that, the two most remediable causes of death in the U.S. are tobacco and hypertension, both of which there's not a lack of knowledge, but there's an ethos that's developed that doesn't really focus on what people need to know to make good decisions. And of course, we have this also relatively unusual degree of drug overdose deaths. I know Rutgers has been a leader in trying to deal with that. But so I think it's a huge problem. I don't see how the government cannot be involved. But we also, in the U.S., we have a thing called the First Amendment. We're not involved by suppressing people's right to speak. People have a right to speak. We're not in the business of shutting down people who speak. But I'll leave it with one other statement. So then you say, what do you do? I've talked to every expert I can find in the field of misinformation. As many of you know, there's a growing body of knowledge about misinformation. People can describe it. They can describe the epidemiology, how the things get into systems of reverberation in social media. I haven't found a single expert that thinks they have a solution to the problem at this point. So there's some things that we need to do. We can talk about those, but in terms of a real solution, it's really, I think, a tough problem.
Sure, and I can talk about it from the Canadian perspective. And as I was telling you earlier last week, during the pandemic, I'll focus on that. I was tapped to lead communications for both Health Canada and the Public Health Agency. So this is an area I've thought about a lot and have been very involved in. With the onset of the pandemic, of course, you'll all remember that there was a relentless need for deep, accurate, quick information for us to develop health policies and responses and to bring along the public. And this was an environment where the science was evolving very quickly and things were changing. So I can say that, behind the scenes, there were genuine and heroic efforts, I would say, made to disseminate information that was factual and accurate as quickly as possible. But sometimes, because the science was evolving, when you were saying one thing one month, sometimes things changed the next month. And so unfortunately, this all led to an unprecedented surge. So misinformation, disinformation has been around a long time, but we saw this surge over that pandemic period. And as we progressed through, we realized that we'd need to have mass buy-in from the public in terms of adhering to public health guidelines, vaccinations, and for these things to work. And so misinformation and disinformation for the Canadian government really became a center of desk issue, and was a real and present threat to moving our policies forward or having them being effective. So what we do know is that accurate and timely information, as you've pointed out, is absolutely key in protecting the health of our citizens, and in some cases in saving lives. And of course, when journal publications contain misinformation and those are shared and amplified through mainstream media, social media, and also broadcast to people who are very, very hungry for information, it can amplify some of those issues. And we witnessed this many, many times through COVID, as more studies were published and sometimes were, frankly, of low or of questionable quality. So, there's no silver bullet, there's no one solution, but we know that it's going to require new tools, different approaches, and lots of partnerships. So I think it's not just governments that have a role in this, but, really every organization that's represented in this room and online. We've been doing some behavioral science studies to understand how misinformation is tied to decision-making of individuals. And what we found is that, our policies and our programs and the communications that we undertake, if we don't take into account how real human beings are engaging with them, then we're destined not to succeed. So, for example, some of our behavioral science research has shown that the ability to identify misinformation has consistently been predictive in people's intentions, for example, and behaviors towards vaccine uptake. And there's other research, not by the government of Canada, that has shown the same thing in terms of public health measures. And so our need to address misinformation and disinformation has been a main pillar of the government of Canada's response throughout the pandemic and continues to be a burning issue. Some of the tools that we've used for public opinion research, for behavioral research, went in a number of subsequent ways throughout the pandemic period. We did a study called Cosmos, and that was in collaboration with the WHO. And we collected data over 16 different waves from April 2020 to November 2021. This was data we were looking at very closely. And some of the things that we found over time was that the sources that people turn to and that they trust for information were very, very much linked to their level of compliance and with public health measures. And so most importantly, the ability for them to identify what was misinformation or disinformation, along with their trust in institutions, trust in science as well, has been shown to really associate the willingness to receive a COVID vaccine. So we categorized, populations and subpopulations. We knew that there were people on one end who would had a high degree of trust and would get vaccinated. We knew there were people that would probably never get vaccinated, but we had a very large group in the middle that we call the movable middle. And we thought if we can just, get information out there that's pertinent to them, not influencing, but their decision at the end of the day, but at least providing them alternate information and the information that we knew was important, then perhaps we could move that middle towards more vaccination. And it's when we went through these studies and we saw how people were moving in terms of their trust levels of institutions and information. We also saw our vaccine uptake numbers moving as well. So the big question, was that enough? Probably not, but we tried to do a lot to move things, but we did have some successes in some areas. One area of success in the regulatory space, of course, was we had some accelerated ways of reviewing vaccines, and that created disinformation and some mistrust. But one of the things that we did in one area called rolling reviews is we really took the time to present what that actually meant. So it didn't mean, we were reducing the amount of hours or the rigor with which we were looking at the safety of vaccines, but we were really looking at it in a different way so that we could compress the timelines and give Canadians access to these life-saving vaccines in a more timely way. So that was one thing, but I would also just say that, trust is extremely key here. So it's not just the work of us and as regulators and governments, but the work of everyone who works in this field to think about these things and, to look, maybe change our way of how we, develop not only the science, but also our policies, so that we're designing for trustworthiness by showing our ability to execute benevolence, compassion, and integrity. You know, essentially saying, doing what we say, what we're going to do. So those are just a few reflections. You know, we could probably spend all day just on this topic, but a few reflections from the Canadian perspective.
That was a great summary. If I could just make one point, I think, well, two related points. We're going to be put to the test here coming up shortly. For the first time in history, we have effective vaccines for all three of the viral pathogens that kill people my age. I'm turning 72 in September, and I'm planning on getting all three vaccines, but I would predict that you pharmacoepidemiologists will be able to see very reasonable correlation between the number of appropriate vaccines that people get and the proportion of people in that category who die or end up in the hospital, jamming up our healthcare system and having bad health outcomes. Canadians are just nicer than US people, I'm afraid. Yeah, they tend to go along with what people say. We've got a real uphill struggle in the US. So the related point is a point you made that I think is so critical. Everybody needs to take this on. People do, our research shows the same thing. The dominant factor right now is the source of information that people have. And there's a lot of people in the US, if it comes from the FDA or the CDC, they're going to discount it immediately. But they do listen to people that are in their neighborhoods who they consider to be knowledgeable, including doctors, nurses, and people that work at universities and in other areas. So this is not a time to be a shrinking violet. This is a time to have courage and talk about these things.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So in addition to their doctors and nurses, what we found was that a lot of people looked to their community leaders. So not necessarily someone with a health background. And so like the US, where we have a much smaller population, our 40 millionth baby was born earlier this summer. So when you think of 40 million people in Canada versus however many million there are in the US,
340 million.
340, we're your little brother. But it's a very diverse population, lots of, different needs, lots of immigration to Canada. So some of the things that we did were we translated, some of our key information into 25 different languages, all of our public communications into a number of different languages. And we went to untraditional ways, like reaching out to community leaders in different groups of large diaspora groups to reach people and just provide the information. They could make they could discern how they wanted to disseminate that information or what they wanted to share, but at least make it available to them. So again, not a silver bullet, but one of the different things that we did to address some of these issues.
And one of the things in the US and in academia that was a struggle was the diversity and the disparities. We all had trouble, in fact, recruiting minority populations even into trials of the vaccines, even though they were higher risk because of the lack of trust of the medical community given the past history. And the other thing that may be different in the US, but I'm very curious in Ham's response. Rob alluded to the First Amendment, and to lawsuits. We were the first university in the country to require vaccination of our students. It triggered a wave of lawsuits. They're still going on. I can tell you 2 weekends ago, we still got thousands of emails timed for that weekend to all come in simultaneously. How can you be expecting your students to get vaccinated with this terrible vaccine, which is killing people? And it turns out when you look at it, none of those emails were from either the students or the parents. It was clearly an engineered effort. The politicization of science and science misinformation has really been an enormous problem in the US. Mm-hmm. And it's has led to many deaths, I think, as Rob was alluding to in the process. We still have suits underway. In follow-up. I don't know, is it like that in Canada?
We also have suits underway. So, maybe, smaller population, but the litigious nature, I think, is something that all jurisdictions are experiencing. So that is something that we're experiencing as well. So it's a, an area to watch. Of course, we have, as well as, you alluded to First Amendment, but we also have a Freedom of Information Act or equivalent in Canada. So making that information of what we of how we authorize vaccines and how we made policy decisions in terms of mandatory vaccines, really, really important to have that transparency as well.
I mean, the sad thing is, in many ways, this was all anticipatable. Before COVID, only half of people in the US, at least, got flu vaccine. I mean, Rob talked about the 3 respiratory viruses all at once now. So, why necessarily would you expect that COVID uptake would have been that much better? But one of the things, and, picking up on Rob's challenge that we all need to be involved in this. One of my pet peeves here is this is a failure of science education at the elementary and middle school level. That we've grown a population of people who don't understand the scientific method, don't understand, as Pam was talking about, new data comes in, recommendations change as the new data come in. And I've been reaching out to our education school dean to say, it's our fault that the population isn't well educated scientifically, because we keep the best minds in biology at the universities. They're not teaching in the elementary schools and so on. Are there ways we can be part of the solution to try to change that? And it's striking the lack of interest. Now we're about to get a new dean, so hopefully that'll change, but it's
Well, Brian, you're pretty frank in the way you discuss things. I'm a university person at heart, that, but I love to pick on universities. And I thought universities were here to find the truth and to educate the public about the truth. And if I had to pick on one group that needs to really wake up right now, and I worry that a lot of university leadership are backing off because of the controversy it creates if you take this issue on, particularly as it relates to wealthy donors. And it's something that's just going to need to be dealt with. I'll also note, the NIH pulled back on a pretty substantial grant program on scientific communication while all this is getting sorted out. And I hope there will be funding. So regardless of what you believe, that, we do educate people better on how to communicate.
As a last question, I don't know if each of you want to talk about collaboration between the two of you. I mean, an audience like this certainly knows either Canadian regulation, US regulation, probably not both, and probably not the amount of collaboration that goes on behind the scenes. Of course, regulators, can you share that with us?
Okay. So yes, I mean, the collaboration for us is absolutely key. So as I mentioned earlier, 40 million population, large geography, lots of, regionality versus, urban, people living in urban areas, and a very diverse population, a number of underserved populations, and vulnerable populations as well. So how does a country the size and with the resources that Canada have present itself as a world-class regulator and ensure that Canadians have access to medications? Well, we partner and we collaborate. And I would say our collaboration with the US is a very critical one. We not only share a border, but, we have very similar, population makeups, and some of the, things that you mentioned earlier are echoed very much in the Canadian landscape. So I think that we can build on that collaboration, not just with the US, but also with other partners, such as our colleagues through the ICMARA group and specifically for real world evidence. I know that ICMARA, for example, has a observational studies working group, and by advancing various topics that group is working on, we can continue to have dialogue and benefit from each other's expertise.
Yeah, we this thing called Zoom and telephones that we use frequently, whether it's infant formula or shortages of Tylenol and amoxicillin that have happened. So we really work together a lot behind the scenes. We deal with the same body of evidence. Our cultures are different. You're nicer and friendlier. We're more individualistic.
Bow ties.
And So we may interpret things a bit differently, but this discussion that goes on about particular topics and strategies for regulation, very important. Although you're nicer, we're bigger, as you pointed out, and we are acutely aware that things that we do in the U.S. have an impact in Canada that's outsized compared to other countries. So we're particularly sensitive to making sure we do communicate with Canadians. I would point to the real world evidence collaboration as one that's been fruitful. I do think even that document, I read it carefully last week, it's still missing that middle piece of pragmatic randomized trials that use real world data and do things at a much lower cost and get reliable answers. Or I could say, why do we have to ask the UK what the right treatment is for COVID while we're doing these elaborate clinical trials with all the biomarkers and the huge expense? They went to work and randomized people in their health system and used the EHR for follow-up and reeled out answers in a very short period of time that were pretty definitive. So I would like to put forward, as the US government works on this, we should definitely collaborate. Traditionally, in my career as a cardiologist, the Canadians, McMaster and Alberta, have been real leaders in pragmatic clinical trials. So we have a great opportunity here to take the best of real world evidence and traditional clinical trials and create something that's even more effective.
Great. With that, I'd like to thank Pam and Rob and turn it over to Rob to lead the next section of the panel. Thank you, everybody.
All right, well, we'll do some shuffling here. I will ask all the panelists to come up. You have the right number of chairs, I think we did. All right, so we're going to have some fun here with a panel discussion, and we're going to kick it off with three panel presentations. But before we do, I'd like to just ask everybody, starting at the far left, introduce yourself briefly so the audience will know who you are.
Yes, thank you. So Patrice Vepillard, I'm a medical doctor by training, pharmacoepidemiologist, and I'm the head of the real-world evidence work stream within the task force at the European Medicine Agency, which is dealing with data analytics and methods.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Yoshiaki Uema from Pharmaceutical Medical Device Agency and Japanese Regulatory Agency. I'm responsible for the all regulatory science research right now. I'm Associate Executive Director of the agency, and utilizing the real world data, one of the key hot topic area in Japan. So look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Catherine Donegan. I'm Head of Epidemiology at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the UK. I sit in the Safety and Surveillance Division in our newly transformed agency, working across medicines, vaccines, and medical devices. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michalios Vexberg. I'm the head of the Pharmaceutical Registration Department in the Medical Technologies, Health Information, Innovation, and Research Directorate in the Israel Ministry of Health.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Campman. I am a manager of the Real World Evidence and Data Analytics Division at Health Canada's Marketed Health Products Directorate. I am a pharmacoepidemiologist by training, and I am very pleased to be here this morning. Thank you.
And good morning again. I'm Donna Rivera, and I'll get started with the panel presentation. So to begin the panel session, I'm going to talk about clinical evidence generation using real-world data, examples from FDA oncology. So building on just what was discussed in the fireside chat, presented here is a model for the clinical evidence generation continuum, with clinical trial data on the far left and real-world data on the far right. Data can be generated from both clinical trial data and real-world data to comprise clinical evidence, and it's important to think about how we can incorporate various types of evidence to be most efficient and patient-centric. This is notably not shown as a dichotomy, but as a continuum. And here are shown how different designs fall within the continuum. For example, Randomized controlled trials are prospective, interventional, randomized to balance patient characteristics with highly monitored protocol-based care and strict eligibility criteria. As we move to the right, decentralized and hybrid approaches can retain many of the RCT characteristics with the opportunity for remote visits or use of telemedicine. Pragmatic trials increase flexibilities, such as an assessment frequency with selective monitoring and may be embedded in routine clinical care with broader eligibility. And truly observational studies are often retrospective, non-interventional, non-randomized, with routine clinical assessments in routine clinical care, affording the broadest population eligibility. And within this context, it is really notable that there are increasing opportunities to use real-world data prospectively as well. And another part to mention is that there begin to be a lot of blurring of the lines when we think about this hybridization of designs, or the middle. This is the gray area where many questions are actually arising within the field. In fact, in the most recent Canadian RWE guidance, many of the public comments were received in this area, which highlights the opportunity for pharmacoepidemiology to bring clarity to the gray. Both clinical trial data and real-world data can be part of innovative approaches that bring clinical research and clinical medicine together toward a learning healthcare system. When using real-world data for effectiveness, it's important to think about the context and the clinical setting. Randomization is our most powerful tool to balance known and unknown prognostic factors. So to be clear, when generating evidence for efficacy, for regulatory review, when you can randomize, you should randomize. Therefore, non-interventional studies are most applicable in situations where there are feasibility challenges, ethical concerns, or lack of clinical equipoise. Potential applications for the use of real-world data in these instances may include pediatrics, rare diseases, areas of significant unmet medical need, and underrepresented populations to advance health equity. From a regulatory lens, there are various approaches to the use of real-world data, and I'd like to highlight an example of regulatory thinking. In the FDA RWE framework, the first question is whether the real-world data are fit for purpose. This corresponds to an idea of thinking about appropriateness of use. So is the real-world data appropriate, especially with the design, to allow it to be fit for purpose? The next question is whether the study conduct meets FDA regulatory requirements. The corresponding regulations in Section 314 are around whether a study can be deemed adequate and well-controlled investigation as a primary basis for substantial evidence. And so talking a little bit more about a closer look at what constitutes adequate and well-controlled investigations, such studies have a clear statement of objectives with pre-specified analyses, design that allows for a valid comparison to a control, patients that are selected appropriately, minimization of bias in the treatment assignment, and reliable assessments and analysis to assess the drug effect. So taking a closer look at all of these together, the next question and last question in the framework is whether the trial or study design used to generate real-world evidence can provide adequate scientific evidence to help answer or help answer the regulatory question, which is really the FDA's evidentiary standard for effectiveness or requirement for establishing substantial evidence of effectiveness. Typically, substantial evidence is established by 2 adequate and well-controlled studies or 1 adequate and well-controlled study with confirmatory evidence. And the real-world data for this can be pivotal evidence or supportive evidence for medical product approval. And speaking of approval, in FDA oncology, we've had a handful of examples of the use of real-world data to support regulatory approvals, and I will highlight one now. Alpelisib received accelerated approval in April of 2022 for the treatment of patients 2 years of age or older with severe manifestations of PIK3CA-related overgrowth spectrum who require systemic therapy. This was through EPIC-P1, a single-arm clinical study in patients treated as part of an expanded access program for compassionate use enrolled across 7 sites in 5 countries. and the data from this clinical study was abstracted from medical charts and radiographic images at participating clinical sites. The primary endpoint was response at week 24 as determined by blinded independent central review. So to bring a bit of regulatory context to support this decision, the conduct of a single-arm study and use of data with blinded independent central review from expanded access programs was appropriate considering the rarity and high unmet medical need. From a rationale perspective, there was mechanistic plausibility and early clinical data, making it challenging to conduct an RCT. It was a rare disease with a low prevalence of 14 people per million, with no currently approved available therapies in an area of high unmet medical need. The plans were predefined for this, including predefined plans for study objectives, enrollment guidance, and statistical analysis plans, as well as objective outcome validation, again, through blinded independent central review, which allowed in combination of the ability to provide substantial evidence of effectiveness and a positive risk-benefit assessment. I would like to conclude by noting that as the use of RWE increases, the FDA is responsive to the drug development needs and has recently released a variety of guidances led by the Office of Medical Policy in collaboration with the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the Centers for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and the Oncology Center of Excellence. These guidances include information as listed here, with 2 focusing specifically on real-world data sources, including electronic health records, medical claims, and registries, as well as 3 focusing on submissions, including the use of real-world data, and the most recent guidance that is highlighted here in design, which specifically pertains to externally controlled trials. And there may be many pearls you can take from our guidance or presentations from many of my colleagues throughout this conference. And with that, I would like to and hope that you might take and encourage you to take this pearl. The modernization of evidence generation continues to evolve. So please come talk to the relevant review divisions at the FDA early and often about a drug development program. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank my wonderful colleagues in the Oncology Real-World Evidence Program, especially Dr. Paul Klutz and Dr. Kathy Lero, who are here at ICPE, as well as many of my colleagues across the agency, including in the various divisions in CBER, CDER, CDRH, OOD, and OB, as together, we all are working collaboratively across the agency to advance the use of real-world data. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. We'll now go to Health Canada for discussion of rare disease.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of some examples of how we look at real-world evidence in rare diseases at Health Canada. So to provide a little bit of context, so approximately 1 in 12 Canadians suffers from a rare disease, and this includes children. So we know that in Canada, like in other jurisdictions in the world, there are thousands of different diseases, and they don't only affect the patients, they also affect caregivers, they affect families. It's something that's very serious that we know we need to spend a lot of attention on. And we also know that this is because treatments are really only available for a very small percentage of these diseases and populations. So I'm just going to highlight quickly a couple things that Health Canada is doing right now in the rare disease space to try and fill some of these gaps. So I'll speak about this a little bit more towards the end of the presentation, but we recently released our national strategy for drugs for rare diseases. So we'll have a link here that you can access on a What We Heard report that we had published based on initial consultations that we had done on this program. We also pre-published proposed amendments to our food and drug regulations back in December of 2022. And so this was to allow certain regulatory flexibilities that could perhaps enhance access in a faster way. So you'll recall Pam this morning mentioned rolling reviews. So that is one aspect that is being proposed in these amendments. And at the same time, we're also forwarding a pediatric action plan. So we know that a lot of these rare diseases do exist in the pediatric population. So this is another area that we're focusing on. Now, in terms of our currently regulatory approach, so we authorize medical products through a regular review process, so through what we call new drug submissions, as well as through accelerated review pathways. So these consist of what we call priority reviews or a notice of compliance with conditions. So for example, a notice of compliance for conditions would be on a drug for unmet needs, where it shows, promising evidence of efficacy. And then we want to see what is happening kind of in use in the real world based on certain conditions that we may put on that product, excuse me. If you look here on this slide, so this is just a little bit of an overview of the types of evidence that we received between 2019 and 2021. So this is information that was out of a master's thesis of a student who was supervised by the director of our Marketed Health Products Bureau. So you'll see primarily RCTs continue to be the evidence that is most often submitted to Health Canada, as well as single arm studies, but we have seen increases over time in real world evidence coming in submissions. And before I get into rare diseases themselves and a quick example, I just wanted to highlight some of the limitations that we tend to encounter, both when we're looking at approving a drug using real world evidence to contribute to the totality of the evidence, and also when we're rejecting real world evidence. So you'll see a number of limitations that appear here on both sides, comparability issues being one of the major limitations, both in terms of the consideration when we're either approving or rejecting. And you'll also see that missing data also tends to be a very large factor that does often lead to us not approving a drug based on the real world evidence. Now, in terms of how things work pre-market at Health Canada, as I just mentioned, we look at real world evidence as part of the totality of evidence. So it is not necessarily looked at by itself, it's how it contributes to the entire picture for a specific product. So when we have submissions, we do receive submissions, as I mentioned, that include real world evidence. So back in 2019, and this was coming out of R2D2, which Pam had mentioned before, we had a notice to industry that appeared on our website saying that we would be open for business in terms of accepting high quality real world evidence. When we posted that, we also had an accompanying document that had high level elements that would be not prescriptive, but that would help to guide submissions in terms of the type of quality that we were looking for. So we look at both of these when we are doing a drug submission review. We also leverage the recently published guidance that was developed with CADIF on real world evidence reporting. So I know that that will be discussed more during sessions throughout this conference. And we also advise sponsors at pre-submission meetings and also have indicated to them that we would like them to discuss with us kind of early and often about the appropriateness of the real world evidence that they are thinking of submitting. At the same time, we maintain templates. So whenever something comes in with real world evidence, we record it and we elaborate on that in inventories that provide more information on each of the submissions and what the information contained consisted of and what a regulatory decision was. So as an example here, I will mention Carbaglu. So Carbaglu is a drug that was authorized through a priority review back in April of 2015. So this drug is used to treat chronic hyperammonemia in patients with NEGS deficiencies. So this is a disease that is extremely rare, it's life-threatening, and it's usually diagnosed before 2 years of age. So as part of the submission, we received a retrospective review with a clinical course in 23 patients with NEGS deficiency. And so in terms of kind of the strengths of limitations of this, it was a study that had no randomization and no control. However, the patient's data prior to treatment with carglumic acid served as the patient controlled data. We did have the transcription of medical records covering up to 21 years, but we did note that the study itself was really limited to simple statistical comparisons because it is a rare disease and therefore there is a very small number of patients. However, one of the big factors in terms of the decision-making, which you can read about more in the summary basis of decision, which is linked on this slide here, is that the results did indicate a very dramatic drop in blood ammonia levels, and that was within 3 days, and these were maintained over time for most patients. So in terms of a few other quick considerations with this, things that we always take into account. It's a rare disease, clinical trials were not feasible. Again, very life-threatening condition. There was no other treatment approved in Canada for this disease itself. It also had a well-defined pathophysiology and mechanism of action. So in terms of understanding how the drug worked with the disease, and we found that the efficacy results were really supported by that meaningful decreases in ammonia levels. So really it was quite a dramatic response in terms of the benefit with the drug. And also just to note here, the product monograph is at the end of the page here and is linked. We also deemed that safety concerns were manageable with a risk management plan. Now, briefly back to Canada's national strategy for drugs for rare diseases. So this is kind of a four-pronged approach that Health Canada is taking. It's looking at different areas such as improving patient access to drugs, ensuring sustainability, looking at data and evidence, and promoting innovation. And so one of the limitations that has been identified is that, rare diseases are very complex, and this can really impact the consistency of evidence. And this is where we're hoping that real world data and real world evidence do have the potential to fill the gaps. So as we move forward with this, this has now been officially launched on March 22nd of this year. We are really hoping that certain actions under these pillars, especially this collect and use evidence pillar, could help us to identify and access real world data and evidence that could fill these gaps. And we are doing so right now in partnership with CADIF, as well as the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, to kind of see what is out there and what we could collect in the future in certain spaces, such as registries, prospective data, and other areas. So that's kind of a brief overview. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks so much. We'll now move to Israel for a discussion of infectious diseases.
So good morning. So as presented, my name is Michalios Bexer, and I'm the head of the Pharmaceutical Registration Department in the Israel Ministry of Health. So I would like to present today a short overview of real-world evidence used in infectious diseases therapeutic area, especially obviously in the context of COVID-19 pandemic in Israel. So first of all, a few points about our national COVID-19 surveillance database. The Israel Ministry of Health established the National COVID-19 Electronic Health Records surveillance database at the onset of COVID-19 pandemic in Israel. And this database tracked PCR test result and infections and outcome, like hospitalization and mortality rate, that were reported mandatory from all diagnostic laboratories and hospitals in Israel. In December 2020, after following the emergency use authorization of the Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccine in Israel, the Ministry of Health incorporated ongoing vaccination data into this database. All of the data in the database was linked by the National Personal Identification Number of the residents in Israel. Ultimately, several RWE studies and national level analysis were conducted to examine the safety, efficacy, duration of immunity, and effect of different variants on immunity, utilizing this database for regulatory decision on health policy in Israel. So the first example I want to present is a RWE study that was conducted to support the efficacy of 2 doses of mRNA Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine in Israel, the Comirnaty. Initially, at that point of time, there was very limited clinical trial data that supported the vaccine efficacy in older population, and there was no estimation that was available on vaccine nationwide effectiveness, especially against the SARS-CoV-related outcome like severe hospitalization and death. The study objective was to evaluate effectiveness of 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine against the SARS-CoV outcome in individuals aged 16 years and older who were vaccinated with 2 doses of the vaccine versus unvaccinated individuals. The study design was non-interventional retrospective study, and the source data was the National Surveillance Database that contained data from the first 4 months of the nationwide vaccination campaign. Ultimately, the study data contained slightly above 4.71 million individuals that were fully vaccinated within those 4 months. The data was also stratified by age, gender, and calendar week. The conclusion of the study was the 2 doses of the vaccine are highly effective across all age groups, including the older adults, in preventing symptomatic and asymptomatic infection and SARS-CoV-related outcomes. And this study was among the first study conducted to confirm the clinical trial finding in a broader population. This study reinforced Israel Ministry of Health confidence in the efficacy of the vaccine, and of course had immediate implication on health policy in Israel. This study was also published in the Lancet Journal in 2021. I will briefly mention the second study utilizing the same database with the same vaccine now conducted to support the efficacy of the 3rd booster dose. At July 21, the Ministry of Health approved for emergency use authorization a 3rd booster dose. And at that point of time, obviously, there was very limited to no nationwide efficacy data, particularly against the SARS-CoV severe outcome. The study objective was to evaluate the rates of confirmed infection and severe illness among individuals aged 60 years and older who had received the booster dose versus who had received only 2 vaccine doses. The study design, again, was non-interventional retrospective study. And the conclusion of the study was that the rates of confirmed infection and severe outcome was significantly lower in those who received the booster dose than those versus those who receive only 2 vaccine doses. This study again had immediate implication on health policy in Israel, as it strongly supported Israel policy in expanding the booster dose to younger age groups. And this study was also published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2021. So in my last slide, I want to present the Ministry of Health initiative regarding conduction of real-world evidence studies. The TIMNA platform, which is the Ministry of Health National Research Infrastructure for Big Data. And this infrastructure was established in order to encourage the conduction of real-world evidence research in Israel. The TIMNA team includes pharmacoepidemiologists and data scientists, and their activities include, first of all, providing access to the Ministry of Health National Registries and Database. The ministry has over 20 database and registries for different researchers, academia, pharma companies, startup companies. Among the activities include identify data quality issue, and they can determine if the data set is fit for purpose according to the pre-specified study question, and provide forced data anonymization in order to maintain data privacy. So currently there are a few dozen of real-world evidence studies that have been completed or ongoing using the TIMNA platform, and I've added some examples down below of nationwide database and registries, including our COVID-19 national database. I will add some acknowledge that those study was conducted by the Epidemiology Division in our Public Health Services Directorate in collaboration with our Medical Technology, Health Information Innovation Research Directorate. Both of them are in the Ministry of Health. And with that, I will say thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much. And I got to say, for those of you who work in the US or Canada, I don't know, people in the US government are tired of me calling them and saying, why do I have to call Israel to figure out what to do with the next vaccine dose? How is it that we can have 380 million, I guess, combining the 2 countries worth of people, and we don't have such a system in place? But part of what I wanted to get across in the beginning was stay tuned, because there's going to be very significant effort across FDA, NIH, CDC, and CMS to put together such a system. 2 other quick points, just listening to this. I didn't hear a mention of what I think is a much bigger problem now that's emerging beyond dealing with confounding when it comes to observational analyses, and that's this time zero problem that we have. I think we're getting better and better at the methods of dealing with confounding, but if we're measuring the characteristics of people at a time that's different from the inception point, I haven't seen any solution to that problem that at least I would consider good. And it nullifies a lot of, I would say 99% of the observational studies on COVID that dealt with therapeutics you might as well have, I don't know, made it up or something, because it could not deal with that issue. And I also want to put in a plug for common chronic disease. I mean, the diseases that were mentioned here are really important, but I would argue that randomization with real world data is going to be one of the most important tools going forward for common chronic disease, where we need to understand the effects of treatments over long periods of time, and also have heterogeneous balances of risks and benefits in the population. I shouldn't have to say more than Alzheimer's drugs and obesity drugs for you to understand exactly what I'm talking about in that regard. So with that, we'll move into the panel discussion now. And at 9:45, we're going to start taking questions from the audience. I think you can send them in now, but so we're going to truncate the panel discussion a little bit. So be as brief as you can, but clear in your answers. First one, just for Health Canada and Israel, what are the therapeutic areas that you're seeing the greatest use for real world data and real world evidence?
Would you like to go first? Okay. Right. So in Israel, the greatest use is definitely in the oncology therapeutic area, and we see a lot of use for regulatory decisions such as drug development, drug approvals, but also in the context of clinical informed decisions, such as comparison the effectiveness of different authorized treatments. The oncology therapeutic area is definitely followed by the rare diseases therapeutic area, obviously, and I feel that I have to address the infectious disease therapeutic area, which I talked about a minute ago. So we are seeing great use in the infectious disease therapeutic area, and there are numerous studies that are being conducted utilizing real-world data in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of them are utilizing the Ministry of Health National Surveillance Database within the TIMNA platform. So this is basically it. I think the oncology and the rare diseases therapeutic area, and of course the infectious diseases.
So I will echo Michal's thoughts and observations here. I do think that oncology and rare diseases are the two biggest areas for us as well. And I also think that these are, very much the most promising areas where we could use real world data, real world evidence in the future to help to fill the gaps, noting, of course, that we do need that high quality data, that high quality evidence. We need to kind of figure out how to access that data and look towards those new data sources. So I'll keep my response brief here, but I'll say that I agree.
Great, thanks much. Let's go to the FDA and the PMDA with a question. What are the biggest challenges that you see in regulatory review of real world data, real world evidence? And what are the opportunities for standardization of protocols? Do you want to go first, Donna, and then we'll go to Japan?
So yeah, I think the paramount part of this is, as a public health agency, our top priority is ensuring drugs are safe and effective. So really thinking through the challenges are thinking through at the core what you're seeing in the submission. So I think there's an increasing amount of real world data. However, there's much less resultant real world evidence. And I've been thinking a lot about why this is. And I think it's a myriad of reasons, but ultimately it's the quality of the underlying data that's I think been a limitation. So the source quality of the data, the appropriateness of the design, and then how that pertains to the regulatory objective. So for example, the data being fit for purpose, and then thinking about the design appropriateness, throughout the evidence modernization that we've been talking about. It's important to think about ways in which we can hybridize designs or utilize real world data in the context of clinical trials. So I think in the context of those challenges, it's assessing that. It's also ensuring that the right people are at the table, that epi, clinical, biostats, everyone is discussing this in a partnership together to bring that innovation and design and allow increasing diversity of enrollment. And then I think it really comes down to the regulatory objective of the study and making sure that all of these things are seamless together to ensure that you're answering the question appropriately and that it meets the clinical context.
Let's hear some comments from Japan now.
Yes, thank you. So the challenges for us that right now they're facing in Japan is the difficulty to link a patient among the different data sources. That was not that allowed by the law, but recently, so the amended law was passed in the Congress in Japan. So the situation will be improved, but still we have to discuss about how to implement those kind of issue in the clinical practices. The another challenge from the international perspective that probably we need some of the international standard about the data quality or data reliability. So in the PMDA and the review, so we have two main points to hold a regulatory consideration. First, of course, is data design issue. How does the study design is appropriate, and what kind of the analytical method is used that is acceptable by the agency or not. But another point is also more important, that's the data itself, how you can assure that the data quality or the data management practice is appropriate and acceptable by the PMDA. So therefore, we have such kind of the issues needed as an international standard. So as you may know, the ICH working group already discussed about those issues as the GCP innovation. But still, some of the limitation that happen in the current discussion is limiting the discussion and utilizing the real world data as a part of clinical trial, interventional trial studies. So probably we need to consider more about what is the standard that is necessary, acceptable by the agency for the observational study. And another things, the challenges, that's maybe a more later discussion, but I think the sharing the outcome of the study is also important by the agency. So how to utilize our holding database data result can be used for the decision making in Japan. So those kind of the international sharing of the outcome is also important. So particularly the COVID-19, we learned about those data like Israel. So that's kind of the outcome research is very important for the regulatory decision making. So for the international perspective, so we have to promote such kind of the sharing the issue. For that issues, so probably we need some of the report format should be standardized. And the protocol of the study design also should be standardized as international. So those kind of issues are challenging for further promoting the real world data, real world utilization for the regulatory purpose. Thanks.
Thank you. Donna, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just building on what was just said, and I think the question you asked about standardization, I think that the most recent guidance out of Health Canada and CADIF around standardizing reporting, as well as efforts such as Oncology QCard working on standardizing the ability to efficiently review and provide the information needed up front. Our efforts all working towards this goal of how we can standardize submissions and help provide more efficient regulatory review for patients.
Not to put you on the spot, and the others may, as we go through the questions, may want to respond to this one. Having been on the other side of the fence for decades from the regulatory system, I think when people think of these new approaches, one of the greatest fears is the investigator inspecting after the study is done. And what would you say about the relationship between the kind of things you said and what happens with the inspectorate? I know I'm putting you on the spot for a reason.
You're referring to auditing, right? Like the auditing process. Yeah. So I think that the auditing process has certainly become something we become increasingly more important as it pertains to real world data, right? Because the information that's collected may or may not have been collected in the same way we think of in CRFs or other formats. So I think that from that perspective, the most important point is thinking through the guidance is making sure we have access to the source data or certified copies. And I think working through the process early and often in conversation, for example, with the FDA, to ensure that the data is going to be auditable, that it's going to meet regulatory requirements, because obviously you want to reduce the possible risk of doing all of this and then not being able to get back to the source of the data. For example, in the example I presented earlier, there were images available. So you could go back and look at the images and have a blinded independent center review. So I think source quality, auditing, having the conversation early, because as you know, sometimes the data can be challenging in the real world.
Well, I asked the question a little bit rhetorically. This is a chance for me, just for those of you who have dealt with this. We're currently undergoing the biggest reorganization in the history of the FDA, very much involving ORA, the inspectorate. And there will be a task force as part of BIMO, which is the group that does the auditing of clinical studies that will be focused on this particular area. And Donna, not that I criticize slides at all, but your slide that showed randomized clinical trials and then this list of horrible things like collecting everything under the sun, and you can only include rarefied patients. I swear God did not declare that because it's randomized, you have to do all those things that contribute nothing to the answer that you want to get. And so this is part of what we're really trying to deal with, is how do we get studies that are fit for purpose, the point that you made. And so in the law in the US, it actually changed from randomized clinical trials to traditional randomized clinical trials, because we don't want to confuse the process of randomization with all these ornaments that people put on the Christmas tree of a beautiful clinical trial and clutter it up with all this stuff.
We agree.
It's not necessary. But getting the inspectorate into that realm, I think is going to be very important. All right, I've eaten up a little bit of time here with that point, but I thought it was important. Let's go to back to PMDA and MHRA on your most successful examples.
Thank you. So most successful cases, I think it's a very similar situation to the FDA and Health Canada. So the currently is a successful case we have is the utilizing real world data as an external control in the rare diseases. So that means the clinical trial itself is difficult to conduct. And we have more regulatory flexibility for those kind of the issues. And then, so, but I think that's kind of the experience is useful. So more accumulated regulatory experiences allow us to understand the characteristics of real world data and the limitation of the real world data. That is, we can consider how those kind of experience can be applicable to other area or other situation. So, but still, the currently successful case is limited in such kind of the rare disease or something. So one of the example is now we use the patient registry in the rare cancer, and then compare between the clinical trial data and the registry data about the response rate. And then so that is useful for our regulatory decision making to confirm the efficacy, some of the efficacy of the investigational drug.
And I think from an MHRA perspective, obviously I work in safety and post-authorization largely, so real world data is our bread and butter. It's helped us identify, characterize, quantify risks in patients, and really been critical to decision making. But I think what's exciting now is that we're starting to see real world data really help us understand the impact and effectiveness of the decisions that we are taking on a system-wide basis, but on an individual patient level basis, and really helping us understand where measures are working, where they're not, and potentially why they're not, and helping us to, improve our regulatory position over time. I think reflecting on some of the discussion we've heard already, I think particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic, real world data was critical in our communications. I think it really helped us explain to the public why certain decisions were being taken with the vaccination program in the UK. It may not have helped tackle misinformation that was already out there, but I think it certainly helped minimize the impact of these evolving data on the safety of the vaccines in terms of reducing uptake. Also in COVID-19, and it's already thankfully been mentioned, the recovery trial, I think, was one of the most impactful trials we certainly ever seen in the UK. So for those who perhaps aren't aware, it was a platform trial that was launched and operated from the University of Oxford in the UK, randomized nearly 50,000 participants over 200 sites, started recruitment within about 2 weeks of COVID-19 hitting the UK. It was, as I say, a platform trial, so looked at multiple different potential therapeutic treatments for COVID-19, demonstrated the efficacy, effectiveness of dexamethasone, among others, but I think also importantly demonstrated in a pandemic situation what didn't work, and could really help us target efforts to other things.
Just two quick follow-on questions. The softball question is recovery going to become now more of a standard practice in the UK? Are you going to forget about it now that COVID's waned down, or are you going to apply this to other?
I think the ambitions are certainly to keep that type of study up. You know, we're going to get the real world data coming in through the recovery trial from the EHRs for a decade. And the infrastructure is now there, and the collaboration with the healthcare service to try and build that forward.
Great. We're going to try to give you a run for the money in the US to see if we can cobble together in our dissociated health system something that can compete. And then second question is, can you really look at safety independently of looking at efficacy? Because it seems like an advantage of these longer term randomized trials is you see both sides of the coin. And certainly in my field of cardiology, the benefit is almost always greater in the people in whom the risk is also higher of a toxicity or side effect.
I think we can't look at them in isolation, but I think we have. We're not good at looking at effectiveness, or as good as looking at effectiveness, and really understanding that benefit risk balance once a product is out there and being used.
Let's fix that.
That's
Together. Great. Thank you. How about where we're headed now? And we'll get a word here from EMA, and a bit of a word about the use of, dare we say it, AI, something no one's talking about now, of course.
Yes, indeed. So thanks. So the way we see the move in terms of real world evidence definitely is that it's obvious for everyone that after many years of doing safety post-marketing, looking at effectiveness, the use of real world data is also critical now in the early phase of developments. And we see this in Europe, but I guess in everywhere in the world, that we use also this kind of data for incidence, prevalence of disease, looking at the characteristics of the population, support to the clinical trial design, the representativeness of the population included. We looked also at the natural disease history to inform indeed how it will be in terms of outcome and things like this, and also getting some data on critical populations like pediatrics or pregnant and lactating women that we don't have so often, I would say, in another setting. So this is obvious now. Another important change, I would say, is that the delivery of real-world evidence is not only the responsibility of the pharma industry now, and we have here also a critical example in Europe where we have access now to a network of data, network of expertise and service like Darwin EU, which is the data analysis and real-world interrogation network, where we have onboarded 10 data partners in Europe, different countries, up to 8, and we are still continuing to onboard more. So this is a new way of dealing with real-world data for regulatory decision-making. And when it comes to what you said, in terms of methods, I think that regulators have been quite slow adopters of new methodologies because you need to see and wait how it works. So, but there is quite an intense work, I would say, on the TTE, target trial emulation. We worked also on the estimates. It has been very used in the clinical trial setting, but with the TTE also we see that it will be more and more applicable to real world data. And the use of AI methodology, it's also something which is coming quite a hot spot. We have published in July a reflection paper on the use of AI. We started some pilots specifically in safety to help identifying signals. We know we use also AI since many years already in the definition of propensity scores, for example. So this will come definitely a hot topic and more, and we need to work on this and see how we can manage this.
Great, thanks. And Israel on that topic?
Yeah. So my answer is a more general answer. So first of all, we believe that we will see a continuous increase both in diversity and availability of real-world evidence, and that is because we are seeing today increase in sources, in different sources. We know we have the wearables device, the sensors and the smartwatches and the mobile apps. But even the patient registries and medical health records and medical claims that they are currently being collected in more high quality manner and will become more beneficial in the future for conduction of real world evidence studies. The second thing is we believe that we will see a broader acceptance of real world evidence studies that can inform decision-making, regulatory or clinical decisions. And the broader acceptance will be not just by regulatory agencies, but all stakeholders, for example, patients and clinicians and pharma companies, trusting real-world evidence really to inform decision-making. And that is because we are seeing an increasingly, our RWD is being recognized as a valuable source of information, not just on the post-marketing phase that we talked about, but for drug development and drug approvals and reimbursement and clinical decisions. And really the combination of increase in availability and diversity and increasingly real-world evidence being accepted, this combination will lead to form the basis of knowledge and data sharing. And we believe that wherever data is shared across organization and institute, that will lead to more comprehensive and informative conduction of real-world evidence. And just to address our innovative method that we are seeing today, we know that are several innovative methods to conduct and analyze real-world data, and such as, artificial intelligence and machine learning tools and NLP and digital tools, and they all have significant ability to improve data quality and data validity, and to improve and increase the data collection and analyzing and interpretation of the data. And so we think that the question is not whether should we use it, but rather how should we use it? And the regulatory answer will be to use it in appropriate and responsive manner. And that means addressing those challenges. And we talked about some of the challenges that we are facing today with overall real-world data and real-world evidence. But on top of them, there are several challenges to be addressed using those innovative methods. For example, transparency. We know that not all, for example, machine learning tools are applying transparency and traceability, and that is a crucial factor in the regulatory context. And the quality of the data that is coming into those models, and we need to monitor and validate this data that is coming into those to those models. And of course, transparency, of course, data privacy. And we need to make sure that the data is anonymized and the sponsor is providing a rigorous method of the identification of the data. So overall, we think that real-world data and real-world evidence is definitely headed to greater use, greater availability, greater acceptance. But on the other hand, we need to address those challenges that come with those use of the innovative methods.
Great. All right, we got 7 minutes left for the last two questions. So let's look at areas for collaboration and pilot studies that may be going on. And here, Health Canada, I think you're up first.
Yeah, so I think this is such an important area, and I can speak to the fact that we've made a lot of progress in the past. So Pam had mentioned ICMRA. So at the start of the pandemic, we all came together as regulators through the ICMRA Real World Evidence and Observational Studies Working Group to try and address the pandemic together using real world evidence. So this led to a lot of really important initiatives. So we had technical work streams. There was one on vaccine pharmacovigilance where regulators got together and they all talked about, what are you seeing? What are the hesitancy or misinformation issues? What are studies that are out there? We had one on building cohorts of COVID-19 patients, and that one was actually led by Health Canada, where we had 3 different studies that were initiated. So one that was led by FDA on natural history of coagulopathy, one that was initiated by the EMA on steroid use, one that we initiated looking at the validity of ICD-10 codes for COVID-19 over the different waves. We had another group looking at the use of medicines in pregnancy that is continuing research right now, led by the EMA, looking at the consign protocol and advancing that throughout different jurisdictions. So we had those building blocks. From there, we had a ICMRA real world evidence workshop where we all got together. We talked about how can we continue to advance? What are the gaps that we want to fill together as regulators, which then led to a statement and a commitment by all of us to work together. And so we need to continue doing this. And I think this is really the future. So as one kind of last example, we do have a real world evidence, real world data ICH reflection paper that is out right now on the ICH website for public comment. So that is looking at areas such as greater convergence on terminology, looking at ways where we can increase transparency. So for example, the publication of study protocols, ensuring that everything is accessible, that we can continue to work together to kind of forward in this area. So I really think it's just that emphasis on continued collaboration and looking at the different means of doing so.
Great. And EMA and ICH have something to say here too.
Yeah, and I think Mel said everything. Maybe just to specify that ICMAR is the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Agencies, because I'm not sure everyone is aware of this. So where indeed, I think there are 24, if I remember well, indeed regulatory agencies worldwide contributing to this. So the reflection paper is definitely important next steps in terms of ICH that will also complement the ICH M14 work, which is currently ongoing. Where Mel is involved in. In terms of collaboration, I will say for sure ICMAR and all the cluster work has been critical. But I would say from a European perspective, we had for sure also collaboration with the WHO on this kind of topics. We have also collaboration with the European Control Center for Disease Control, the CDC in Stockholm, because we have an extended mandate at the European Medicine Agency to indeed be more going into crisis preparedness, discussing monitoring and shortage of medicines. So these are all also the kind of collaboration we could have, as well as HTA bodies, because there is also a change in Europe currently with more European type of HTA organizations. So these are all the kind of collaboration, in addition for sure to regulators, which is also critical which are critical to have.
Thanks. Very concise and important. So in the remaining 3 minutes, let's go to MHRA and FDA to talk about what ICPE can do with academic and industry collaboration.
Well, I think in brief, ICPE can do a lot. What can't they do? But I think talking about the use of real world evidence around authorizations, I think for us, one of the key gaps is, case studies, examplers to help us really understand how these methods can be used and how we can better understand them for supporting regulatory decision making around authorization. I think the call has already gone out, but to sponsors and investigators or potential sponsors, potential investigators, come and talk to us early. We are incredibly keen to discuss potentials for real world data around authorizations with you. Quite happy to offer formal scientific advice meetings, bringing together colleagues from pre and post licensing as well as our inspectorate colleagues and colleagues from our real world data arm, the clinical practice research data link, who can really help us to understand issues around data quality and reliability. I think more broadly, there's a couple of real sort of priorities for the MHRA at the moment. I think real world data can offer great insights to, firstly around health inequalities and equitable access to medicines. And that includes how we can use real world data to increase the diversity in clinical trials, but also to better understand differences in the benefit risk profile across different groups. And then similarly, issues around pharmacogenomics. We are launching in the UK, the UK Yellow Card Biobank, which is going to have 2 demonstrator projects this year, which is going to help us to try and understand potential genetic markers that are risk factors for specific ADRs. But the wealth of data that we're seeing around genomics data, I think, is going to be really important in helping us look at the safety and efficacy of medicines in a much more personalized way.
I would very much agree. I think as a scientific community, there's still a lot of work to be done to really understand the use of real-world data and the generation of real-world evidence, especially for regulatory purposes. And I think there's a few items, standardization really on the need for better data characterization, thinking about best practices to assess missingness, the quantification of bias, and evaluating the source's fitness for purpose. So how are we standardizing our ways of thinking around that and objectives in that way around some of the overarching concerns that are still outstanding? And I think there's a lot of collaboration in this area. In oncology, Friends of Cancer Research has really looked at this in a variety of ways, looking at everything from real world endpoints to understanding collaboration and differences across groups. As far as specific items, I think externally controlled trials are an item that is increasing in use. And I think, as was pointed out, time zero, the completeness of capture of studies and the comparability of populations in those is something that additional methods development could be really useful to understand the context of, if not just what we know, so how we understand the knowledge, but translating that to what we do and how you can actually apply that in a regulatory context to make a decision, weighing the benefit risk for a patient population. And then specifically development of real-world endpoints, I think can also help us to elucidate and better understand the context of what we're really getting from this data, the data integrity of the study, understanding the data provenance, and everything from the context of source data auditing to results. And then last, I think I would mention, in this context of the extremes, right, the traditional randomized controlled trial and the observational study, that I think that pragmatic trials offer really an opportunity for epidemiology to expand and work with clinical and biostatistical colleagues. And to that point, OCE has recently launched a Project Pragmatica, to introduce functional efficiencies, enhance patient centricity by integrating aspects of clinical trials with real-world routine clinical practice through appropriate use of pragmatic designs. I think that's an opportunity to understand and find ways in which the community can collaborate to generate better evidence for patients. So I think collaboration is something that, even from a variety of perspectives and as regulatory agencies, our ability to collaborate with the field to advance the better outcomes for patients is paramount.
Great. Now, Donna, do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah.
While they're coming up, this discussion I thought was great, but it triggered every pent-up degree of upsettedness I have over 40 years of working in this field. I'll just pick on 2 to mention. One is that, as I said already, the RCTs don't necessarily have all this stuff that Donna had on the left-hand side of her slide. They're 2 different things. How much clutter you want to put into a study is your decision, but randomization is a tool. One thing that RCTs of all kinds do have, though, is a requirement that you register your study that it's being done in a protocol and that you report the results. We just did a deep dive on clinicaltrials.gov. And amazingly, this actually surprised me. Less than 15% of registered trials fall under the US law of requiring results reporting as a legal issue. And guess what? Where it's required, it's done. It looks really good. But the 85% plus of studies that are registered that are not required to report by law have very poor, way less than 50% of them have results reporting. Now, I would argue this is an ethics issue, not a legal issue, that if you do a study of human beings, you should have certain obligations of transparency. And in that vein, this entire area, who knows how many looks you took at the data before you decided what to report and what to talk about. This is an enormous problem, and it's growing in the literature. And as a group, I would urge you to take this on as a really critical issue. As I said, if you review what was said about therapeutics from observational studies in the COVID literature, the vast majority were worthless or even worse than worthless because they misled people into getting treatments that didn't work. It was when the UK actually did pragmatic randomization that a lot of the useless therapies were rooted out. All right, I feel a little bit better, but I have another list of like 20 other things I want to go through them. All right, so the top question is, are there funding opportunities for academic scientists? I should have known in this group that would come up. Developing new methods in this area. Yes, Donna, go ahead.
So at the FDA, there are a variety of mechanisms for collaboration to advance regulatory science. We have the broad agency announcement mechanism, and there's an annual call for that, as well as U01 mechanism. And then there are additional mechanisms, CIRC mechanisms, as well as research collaboration agreement mechanisms, which are non-funded mechanisms. But I would say across the board, there are a variety of mechanisms if there is interest in collaborating with regulators on specific projects of interest.
Funding mechanisms from others? Yes.
Yes, we have similar kind of mechanism, I would say, with collaborating experts. That's the way we call this. What we have also developed over the last year is also what we call a methodology working party. So we have also access to experts in the field of pharmacoepi where we can connect with and ensure that indeed when we have new questions, you were raising the point about PCTs, that's definitely a domain where indeed maybe the methods needs to be adapted and we need to think more about how to deal with these kind of topics. So there are ways definitely to interact with academics. I'm also thinking that we are currently developing a pharmacoepidemiology curriculum, and some of the people in the room are working with us on that topic to indeed help also to understand and how the method could be used, applied, and hopefully helped to accept. That's a topic we shared, accept indeed real world data, real world evidence when it comes into a regulatory decision making.
Any other comments, Sue?
I will say generally that within our TIMNA platform, our TIMNA team includes pharmacoepidemiologists and data scientists. And our Ministry of Health national databases, first of all, we want the collaboration with the academia researchers. And what the team is doing currently, they accompanied and consult the academia researchers who wants to come and perform real-world evidence studies on the Ministry of Health national databases. And by doing so, they consult and they help them to perform the research and help them to engage with more different methods and to conduct and apply different methods, different algorithms on their study. So I really do think that the TIMNA team can help academia researchers to to find different methods and in cooperation with the Ministry of Health and to apply those methods on their real-world evidence studies.
Great. The next question, is there a need for more pharmacoepidemiologists in regulatory settings? Now, this setup reminded me of the recent Republican debate that went on about the same number of people. So I would just say at FDA, we're hiring, we have jobs. So please apply. We're looking for good people in this area and a number of others. We do have openings right now. So if anyone, raise your hand if you're looking for people in this area. No one, I see no one opposed. All right, so I'd say yes is the answer to that question. Now for a challenging question, which I find very interesting, challenges with using real-world data for regulatory submissions while protecting patient privacy. And I thought of one aspect of this from Donna's comment about this issue. If you're using federated analysis of electronic health records, it is not possible to produce a fixated source document because the EHRs are constantly changing and they're not centrally located. And yet, for some questions, that's going to be the most powerful method. So this is an area where I think there's a lot of opportunity for good work and international standards. But any other comments about submissions and privacy when it comes to real world data?
So submission is a challenge yet, I will say, but I will be part of a workshop just after the break on this topic. And it's true that the way we manage this, I will say in Europe, for example, if we take account about Darwin, which is this federated network, data stays local, for example, because indeed that's a way to not have a transfer of data and face these challenges. But we use a common data model, which is OMOP, and then we're able to react quickly. All this results are going to the coordinating center and centralized, and then these are the results which are transferred to us. So no data is transferred to the European Medicine Agency. In other ways, there are also some methods that are currently under development. I was talking about some of this, virtual controls, for example, or so there are definitely ways to take this into account. Another element in Europe which will change also definitely, it's the Health European data space, where indeed the objective is to get data from the 27 European countries available for research, but here also there are lots of discussion, and privacy is definitely on top of the list, how to ensure that we can get access to this data while preserving privacy rights, because that's one of the key challenges in Europe from a patient perspective and physician.
Fantastic. Sounds like this workshop would be a good one to go to if you're interested in this topic. Any other comments on this? Okay, so this will be a challenge. Now here is I don't know, this is a tough one. How can global regulatory agencies collaboratively address divergent decisions on medical interventions to enhance public trust and achieve scientific consensus? This will be the last question. I'm very interested in your answers to this.
Wow.
Anyone want to take a shot?
Give it a go?
Yes, please.
I mean, I think what the key is countries will come to divergent decisions. Populations have different needs, they have different situations. I think what is important is that we are able to explain those divergences, why we have reached those decisions. We should look to align our guidance as much as possible, so that we are asking for the same things, but we should be explaining why we're interpreting those differently.
I would maybe also just comment that I think there are mechanisms in which some of this is being discussed. For example, in oncology, we have Project Orbis. And so, and Health Canada was one of the three original members of Project Orbis, but Project Orbis essentially has been used to support submission of 369 marketing applications across 8 countries leading to 291 regulatory actions. So I think that this collaborative discussion around it and having a parallel process where all of the international regulators, the cluster calls, are all working together, discussing a lot of these concerns is one way in which we're trying to advance this. And I think as RWE becomes potentially a greater part as we talk about pragmatic trials and some of that more blurring of the lines, gray area, it'll be more important that we're all discussing these together and really communicating the ways in which we make decisions. We also have different regulatory standards across our 6 countries. So I think some of that leads to intricacies in our decisions, but I think best is transparency and communication around our decisions and our thinking, and the platforms and mechanisms we have already to collaborate together internationally.
And if I may add, I think that's where also the ICH work that we're doing together may help. If we're indeed coming to a same definition, same understanding, same common, I would say, methodologies and things like that, definitely this convergence also may help in the future.
Well, thanks so much. I know that we could go on for a long time here. I'll just make a couple of comments about this last question. Just an anecdote. It came home to me over 30 years ago when we did our first big, large pragmatic trial in fibrinolytic therapy for acute myocardial infarction. And the very expensive drug came out modestly better than the less expensive drug. 1 life saved per 100 people treated. That was very acceptable in the US from an economic perspective, and it pretty much carried the day. But I got a call from New Zealand, and the question was, should we buy this more expensive drug that's slightly better, or should we have a cardiologist in our hospital? We can't do both. And so I think some of the decisions that we make are not just because our populations are different, but our economic circumstances, our standard practices of clinical care, and our values are different. My great hope is that ultimately we'll converge on a cloud-based system for regulatory submissions, where we really are confident that we're all looking at the same data and the same analyses, and then we may have different cultural values to overlay on that. And it's trivial now to say it, but there is no technological limitation to having a partitioned cloud-based system for regulatory submissions that would be global in nature. It's really back to the culture and the fact that we do have different laws and different degrees of confidence in international collaboration. So we'll conclude with this. I want to thank our panelists. It was a great discussion. You raised a lot of issues. I would just say you guys in this organization have a lot to work on. I wish you well. Thank you.